Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. Good evening. I'm slightly on, slightly early. Hope everyone is well. And it's freezing down here in Kerry tonight. I presume it's very cold elsewhere in Ireland. Uh, so hopefully we'll have a good hour or so talking about Irish history. Um, a fair few questions ready for tonight. People are beginning to ask them more in advance, which gives me more time to prepare. Um, just some housekeeping first. Um, I will hopefully be releasing a video on Sunday. I'm still in the process of making it, so fingers crossed it'll be out for Sunday. It is on Inishfallen, the monastery in the island in the middle of the lake in Loughlin in Killarney, a lovely place which I recommend to everyone to visit if you can. Try not to go in August. I went in August. It was a bit crowded, but it was good. But I would prefer to have gone at a quieter time. Because if you have to drive down to the park in Killarney in August, it's actually difficult to get parking. So, but it's a good place to go. It's a good place to go. And so I might as well start. Um, Last week I was asked by, hi Dennis, hope you're well, and I hope it's not freezing too much down in Kinsale, because up here in Kerry, or westwards here in Kerry, it's bloody cold tonight. In fact, I think I saw some snow on the top of the mountains earlier today. First snow since February or January this year. So it's chilly night. I had to come back. I had to pick my wife up last night in Killarney, 10 p.m. So I had a cold, wet drive over the mountains. Not the easiest drive in the dark, to be honest. So last week, hi Wayne. Interesting question. Good morning, Wayne. Good morning. Just a little question. Who did the McCarthy's more side with, the Fitzgeralds or the Butlers? Um, they would have sided more with the Fitzgeralds because they were in contact with the Fitzgeralds, or at least most of them. So, like McCarthy Moore, as I said before, was South Kerry, Beara, West Cork, and then near there was your place, Duhallow, and then Muskerry and the other McCarthy lordship in Cork. But they would have been, to the north was Desmond, and also to the east was Desmond. So they were quite a bit away from the Butlers. The Butlers, the Ormond, was Tipperary and Kilkenny, and his influence was those two counties, and then sometimes a bit into Offaly, into the Midlands, sometimes a bit into Wexford, and at times Waterford. So the McCarthys would not have had much direct contact with him. And the Fitzgeralds often bragged that the Kingdom of Desmond, was paying them rent. So occasionally McCarthy Moores paid something. There was a complicated relationship. Um, for example, in Clorglin at the moment, there is like a tiny ruins of a castle. It's just up from the bridge on the right hand side. It's inside a pub of all places, or outside a pub. And that castle changed hands enormously because it kind of marked the river it's on, the River Lawn, in a way marked the frontier between the the northern frontier between the McCarthys and the Fitzgeralds. And so Killorglin changed hands enormously. And whenever one side held this castle, the other side burnt it down. So it was complicated. But um, if there was ever conflict within the McCarthy's or within the McCarthy Moors, you'd be sure that the Fitzgeralds of Desmond they had some McCarthy's on their side, so they interfered a lot, and they said that they claimed some sort of overlordship over Desmond, over South Kerry and Beara. Whether this existed or not in reality, it did sometimes, other times no. But like the the McCarthy Moors got involved in the Desmond Wars, but Donald McCarthy, who was also the Earl of Cloncair, he managed to get out of it without suffering too much. He didn't fight to the end. So, yeah. Whereas with regard to the Butlers, they wouldn't have had much contact, except a bit in the Desmond Wars when Butler was attacking Desmond. So, just to sum up, the McCarthy would have been with the Fitzgeralds. Hi, Kat. No problem. No problem. Hope you're well. Hope you're well. Now, the question I was going to start with, but anyone feel free to ask away. If you want any more information about that, Wayne, just let me know. So, sorry, just one sec. You're welcome. You're welcome, Wayne. No problem, Kat. So last week, someone asked me. I can't remember the name, and I'm actually not sure how to access the feed, the questions afterwards, because whenever I look for it, I can't find it. But someone asked me about the Hickeys, so I said I would look them up, and basically the Hickeys, it's a Ikeda. They were a Dalcash family, so they were distantly related to the O'Briens from the same general group. Um, but they were interestingly a medical family. So they were one of the Gaelic families that had a speciality, and theirs was medicine. And if you look back, there are a few medical treatises by Gaelic doctors discussing, say, Latin medical treatises. One, at least, was from this family. They, with the name being from the Dalcash, you can probably guess where they were based, which was Clare. More specifically, um, Ballyhickey, which means Ballyhicke, the town of Hickeda, the family. This is near Quinn in Clare. And as far as I know, in Quinn, there's still a very nice, very large and very nice abbey or monastery there. I was there when I was like 10. So that was many, many, many years ago. Many years ago. But I remember it still rings a bell with me visiting the place. I was impressed with it. So they were a family specialized in medicine, and then from the 17th century onwards, they would have lost their positions because they would have been connected to the O'Briens, one of the sort of client families of the O'Briens, even though they were like specialized in medicine, but they were still tied to the O'Briens. The O'Briens were their patrons, and although the O'Briens under Thomond were Protestant, were always on the English side, some of their client families did suffer, and they also would have suffered under Cromwell, because Cromwell did march. I think either Cromwell or one of his generals marched around Clare and the Burren. Okay, now Kat asked me a question during the week about the Fenians. There's two different answers to this, because Fenians there's actually a few different answers. So in Irish history, the Fenians, Na Fianna, were a mythological organization of warriors, say Iron Age, early Christian warriors. There's a lot of stories about Fionn McCool. He was the leader of Na Fianna, of a certain group of them at least, because like any Irish mythology, there's lots of stories of fighting between them. There are lots and lots and lots of stories about Fionn McCool, his son Oisin, his grandson Oscar. When Oisin goes to Tir na Nog, meets Neve. Um, there is Dermot Agus Grania, which Dermot was from supposedly from somewhere near where I live, and Grania was the daughter of the High King, and there was a great tragedy based on them because Grania was supposed to marry Fionn McCool, but she didn't like it and fell in love with Dermot and put him under sort of challenge. So he had to run away with her, and eventually they married. It's a very long story, very nice story. So the Fianna were that group. It is mythological, but there may well have existed groups of young warriors called Fians at some stage. Sort of young men would have got together and trained and possibly fought together as these groups. So the stories of the Fianna, there's loads of them. They were very, very popular. And then they became one of the key parts of Irish mythology. So that's one Fianna. Now, that name, Fenians, got applied to a much later group, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, the IRB. So when people nowadays talk about the Fenians in the 19th century, this is who they're talking about. Before I go into them, it's worth pointing out that Fenian is kind of a slur, a pejorative word for Catholic in the north of Ireland. It's used by Protestants, especially, to call someone a Fenian means they're a Catholic and therefore they are, shall we say, disloyal, a rebel, something like that. And the youth wing of the IRA, where I think in the old IRA during the War of Independence, certainly the IRA under Sinn Féin in post-independence and until the 1960s, was called Na Fianna, the Fiannans. There was an IRA split in 1969, 1970. It was a left-wing, right-wing split. The right-wing split was called Provisional Sinn Féin. They're what are now called Provisional IRA and Provisional Sinn Féin. They're what are now IRA Sinn Féin, though it's questionable if the IRA exists at the moment or not. Both the official and provisionals had Na Fianna, though the officials began to disband much earlier. So the youth wing of the IRA was called Fianna. But in relation to Kat, you're asking about what kind of role did women play. In the mythology, there are some interesting stories. Fionn McCool, his father got killed, as far as I know, in some sort of internal feud over control of the Fianna, or his Fianna. And he ends up going, I think, to Scotland. Though they say Scotland, when they say Scotland, it really means the Irish-speaking part of Scotland, where he was trained to be a warrior by a woman. I can't remember the name of this woman. So, and there is another, in the stories, there are another couple of women warriors that appear. And then there are other women, more magical ones, for example, and some are very powerful. In a lot of the stories, the Tuatha Dé Danann appear, but they appear in the way a bit like Tolkien's elves. They are powerful people, powerful beings, human-looking but slightly different. Like in the story, it's Ceann Trá, the Battle of Ventry. Ireland has been invaded, and then someone goes to the Tuatha Dé Danann in Tipperary and says, "Look, can you fight them a bit while the Fianna get ready?" And they say, "Yeah, sure, why not?" And they went and fought for a couple of days and then went home. In other Fianna stories, they're more mystical. Like the most famous is the story of Oisin going to Tir na Nog. He's walking on the beach, which is probably Ross Bay Beach, which many people say is Ross Bay Beach, which is outside Glen Bay. and he's there with his father. They're hunting, and they see a woman on a white horse, I think, riding over the waves, and her name is Neve, and she invites Oisin to go with her. So he jumps on her horse, and they go up off to this island somewhere. Would From where I actually sit and give this talk, I look out over Dingle Bay, so therefore she would have passed in front of my house, like 10 kilometers in the distance. So somewhere out in the North Atlantic here is this magical island. He went there for 3 weeks. He really had a great time, but then he wanted to go home for a while. And story is really well known. And so he goes back on her horse, and she says, "Don't touch the ground of Ireland." So he goes back to Ireland and discovers, like, in the 2 weeks or 3 weeks he spent in Tirnanog, uh, 300 years had passed. So there's none of his friends around. And he sees a group of men who he thinks are very weak trying to push a stone. And he kind of says, "Get out of the way, I can do this." And he leans on his horse, and he gives a big kick, and knocks the stone flying. But then, because this is a story, there has to be a tragedy in it. The Something of his saddle snaps. The saddle strap snaps, and the saddle and him fall off the horse. He lands on the ground, and once he touches the ground, he changes from being a young man to being 300 years old. Eventually, he meets St. Patrick. And then there are other women who appear in these stories. I'm trying to think of. Yeah, there's another magical one which also may have happened around here. Um, in that Fionn McCool was hunting one day, and he chased this deer, and then he chased the deer into some. It could have been a ring fort, or a glade in the forest. And once he got in there, it discovered the deer turned into a woman, and she had been enchanted. And then so Fionn rescues her. Then she becomes his partner, girlfriend, wife, depending what you read, and they have a child who's Oisin. But then something bad happens, of course, and she gets transferred back into a deer again. So you'll find a lot of women. In relation to mythology, I think in the stories with Cuchulainn, etc., there are more powerful women. Davy, you're asking about women. I hear from some history docs that women were treated a little better in the Celtic world. Grace, the so-called pirate queen. Um, Not exactly. Uh, in Gaelic laws, women had some rights that they wouldn't have had under Saxon or English law. But it wasn't a feminist paradise at all. The In a way, there was a currency which was based on the price of a female slave. So Irish Gaelic society was extremely hierarchical. Women at the top had a bit more freedom to act, and I think they could own property, whereas women, lower class women, couldn't. But I know that some people make it out to be this great place where women could do this, that. It's not actually true. I don't think anywhere in medieval Europe would have been great for a woman, especially a peasant woman, or indeed a peasant man. The societies were hierarchical and difficult. Um, the Gráinne O'Malley, Gráinne Ní Mhailí, um, in the 19th century, she became Gráinne Whale, and after that, the idea of the pirate queen was invented. But she would never, no one would have ever called her um, pirate queen, because Elizabeth would, when she was alive, Elizabeth would have had her executed brutally. Um, she's an interesting character, but most of what people hear about her is wrong. She never met Elizabeth. She did go to London. She must have been a strong woman because she managed to run the lordship, the O'Malley lordship. But I think people, when talking about her, they miss there are some other examples of Gaelic women, all elite Gaelic women, um, there are two in Donegal. There is um, the mother and grandmother of Ray O'Donnell. His grandmother was Lady Agnes Campbell. She married Turlough Linnock O'Neill, and then her daughter married one of the O'Donnells, and then her daughter's favorite son was Reggie O'Donnell. When Reggie O'Donnell escaped from prison, she basically ensured that O'Donnell would become O'Donnell. He would achieve the lordship. There was a battle. I think she may even have had a couple of his rivals assassinated. Um, Both of them had very strong connections in Scotland. One was a Campbell. I think the other was uh, she, O'Donnell's mother was called Anian Dove, Black Anian, but I think her name was Fanula, and her mother was Campbell. I think her father was a MacDonald. So they both had access to large number of soldiers. They were very, very powerful women. Another example would have been the last wife of Fiach MacHugh. She's a very interesting woman. It's hard. I've been trying to find out more information about her, but I'm finding it difficult. But for example, she's one of the few women who was proclaimed a traitor during her lifetime. Most of the time, the English were just concerned with proclaiming or getting rid of Gaelic lords. They didn't care about the wives. This was one of the few occasions where a woman was seen as important enough to proclaim a traitor, which I find very interesting. And there's one episode which is quite strange in that um, she persuades Fiach MacHugh to send in his to the English his son from a previous marriage, and he goes into the English, and then the English hang him. Uh, it's a bit of a strange episode, but I find the lady very interesting. Now, I Davey, it was better to be a woman in the Celtic world versus the Roman one, for example, but wrong timeline. Again, I think it comes down to who you are. If you're a slave in a Gaulish tribe, where a slave woman or a slave man, I don't think your life is going to be very good. If you're a slave woman in Rome, again, I don't think you'll have a very good time. Um, where some Roman women were quite powerful, others were very restricted in what they could do. So it's kind of hard to say that women would have been better off in one than another. Possibly, but you had these kind of mega things happening at the same time. Like you could have been having a nice life in Gaul, and then all of a sudden, one morning, along comes Julius Caesar, and then the Romans. If you actually look at what they do, they massacre people left, right, and center. They're very, very brutal, bringing in rule. So you could have been having a good life, and then along come the Romans and kill you and everybody else. It's difficult. Anyway, back to the Fenians. So I'm now going to talk about the 19th century Fenians. So where to start? Um, in the 1790s, there's a movement, the United Irishmen, and they create the idea of, or not create, they really use and they push the idea of an Irish republic, a republic that unites Protestant, dissenter, and Catholic. Um, they agree with the use of armed force to overthrow the British in Ireland. They think the best way to get independence for Ireland is with the help of the French. They appeal to the French. They get some aid from France, but first of all, um, the big fleet that gets sent over gets disrupted and swept away by a storm, and then there is a rising in 1798, which has some success, especially in Wexford, and a bit in Leinster, and then when that's been put down quite brutally, very brutally, a small French fleet, I think with a couple of thousand men, lands in Killala, and there's a famous battle, the races of the races of Castlebar, where they rout the English forces. The English run away, but then in the following battle, the English win, and the the French are defeated. The United Irishmen are destroyed, and for the next 40 years or more, um, there's no real organization calling for an armed uprising, but there are, and there always were, say, peasant groups, agrarian groups that would use violence against landlords and stuff like that. And um, then from the 1820s or 1810s onwards, you have Daniel O'Connell, who politically organizes uh, Catholic Ireland. He's from, he's quite rich, uh, but like he managed to organize the Catholic peasants to get them involved in politics. In a way, he's too successful, but not successful enough. And then in the 1840s, under the influence of Romanticism and nationalism, you have the rise of a group called Young Ireland. And there was a lot of tension between Young Ireland and O'Connell. And it's funny in a way because many, if not most, of the leaders of Young Ireland were Protestant of English descent, such as John Mitchell, whereas Daniel O'Connell was one of the few people who had roots back to, a very minor Gaelic family, the O'Connells. Um, but there's like the Young Ireland eventually decide to have an uprising. It's a complete fiasco. A few of them get sent off to near where Wayne is from. Well, actually, the other side of Australia. I think Fremantle is where the political prisoners were sent to. Um, Many go to the States. John Mitchell is famous, but when he goes to the States, he becomes a bit of he becomes a totally revolting character. He's pro-slavery of all things, and pro-Confederate. So he supports the Confederate cause. I think his son fought in the Confederate Army. So the young Irelanders fade out. Um, Actually, the young Irelanders, many of them end up in the Union Army. There's a guy called Marr. Um, he is credited with inventing the tricolour, which he based on the French one. But the idea was green on one side for the Catholics, orange on the other side for the Protestants, and white in between for peace between them. He ends up as the leader of the Irish Brigade in the Union Army. Um, and he does reasonably well in the American Civil War. Then he's sent off to Montana. I think he's the governor in Montana, and he dies in strange circumstances. I don't know Montana well or Montana history, but he's on a boat. I think it's a biggish boat, and he falls off. Some people think he was pushed off. I'm not sure. Uh, yeah, just going back to Fremantle, there was John. I think it was John Mitchell and four others. Their supporters in the States hired this boat, which sailed from the United States to Fremantle, and they managed to pick up these guys and they sailed off. The Royal Navy chased them and actually caught up with them, and there was a standoff and in the end, the Mitchell and them got away because the Royal Navy captain didn't want to start a war by firing on an American boat. So, United Irishmen failure, Young Irelanders failure. In the 1850s, there's a new attempt to create a radical um, movement for Irish independence, one that supports an armed uprising. In 1858, James Stephens founds the Irish Republican Brotherhood, and he tries to learn from the past, and so he creates cells. So there's you have to take oaths, and there's all these little groups, and it does very, very well. There are a lot of Fenians, or at least many people claim to be. Maybe nowadays there's loads more people claim than were, and they start spreading Bec- because there's a lot of Irish going to the United States. There's loads of Fenians there. Um, I don't know how true it is, but I've read years ago that many people, many of these Fenians, when they're in the States, they decide to join the Union Army to get training. And a lot of them, a lot of the people in the Irish Brigades and Union Army were Fenians. Um, so the Fenians start doing well. Uh, and then, unfortunately, you start having splits. And then the idea was for there to be an uprising, and but the first of all that gets delayed because of the American Civil War, because there's so many soldiers fighting in it, and then I think Stephens doesn't want to go. Probably, I'm fairly sure his movement has been infiltrated. In 1867, they finally have an armed uprising, and it's a farce. The main part was in Talla, which is South County Dublin. I think a group of Fenians gathered there, and then the police shot at them and drove them away. There was also a smaller group here in Kerry, which was actually more successful because at that stage, the year before, the transatlantic cable had started. So they had the idea that they were going to destroy the transatlantic cable and raid the Coast Guard to get guns. So they meeting around Carsavine. They come across the local doctor who's on his horse. So they tell him to get off his horse, and they steal his horse, and they start marching off towards. They do whatever they want to do a bit of stuff in Carsavine, and then they start heading off towards Killarney. And then, like 10 miles or something up the road, they run into a couple of RIC men or policemen. And they capture these guys and they get a new horse. So one of their guys goes back to Carsavine with the doctor's horse and gives it back to him and apologizes for taking it. And then they march on and they reach Killarney. And at this stage, the government is a bit frightened. So there's thousands of police and soldiers wandering around Killarney. And I think there may be 50 of these Fenians, and they're hiding out in the woods. And like eventually, I think after a week or so, they kind of say, okay, nothing's happening, we better go home. So they go home. Some had to flee to the States afterwards. But the Fenians didn't do much at that stage. However, unlike the Young Irelanders, the movement persists. It suffered and was repressed, and many of them are arrested, but then they start doing other actions. They actually do some bombing in England. I think the first bombing, they were trying to blow up the wall of Pentonville prison to release their guys, but they killed passers-by. They may also have put a bomb on the London Underground, or I'm not sure about that. In England, the most famous event is the execution of the Manchester martyrs. So there was a prison van, sort of. This was before cars, so there were some Fenian prisoners being transported in a prison van, and some other Fenians attacked it, and I think they killed a constable. And three of them get arrested and executed. Now, you may have heard an Irish folk song called "God Save Ireland." Um, that's based on the execution of these three guys. They're called the Manchester Martyrs because they're executed in Manchester. Supposedly, the last words that they said was "God Save Ireland." So I know It's a good Republican song. It's an old one. I don't know if many people will still sing it. Um, and then it enters into politics in a way. So in the post famine period, O'Connell dies, and then there's a guy called Isaac Butt tries to rebuild the parliamentary party in Ireland, and the Irish parliamentary party is created, and they start to disrupt, and not so much Butt as in other people. They decide to disrupt Westminster. Now, I remember a few months ago there was a Democratic senator in the U.S. who spoke for, was it a whole day, or I think it could have even been more. So basically, some of the Irish MPs in Westminster began to do this. They said, okay, let's disrupt Westminster until we get home rule. Um, One of the people who was very good at this was a Protestant landlord whose mother was American, Charles Stewart Parnell. And Parnell will dominate the second half of the 19th century in Ireland. Um, he is very charismatic. So he starts off as this disruptor. There was a name for them. I can't remember what it was. And he rapidly becomes very popular. The Irish Parliamentary Party becomes the first party that's whipped as such in England, and it often holds the balance of power. And Parnell says, yeah, if you want my support, we want home rule. And then there are attempts at passing home rule. Uh, the first one doesn't pass because the Liberal Party splits. It eventually passes. The House of Lords rejects it. Then Parnell falls from power. Basically, he was having an affair, and then I find this very sickening. Sort of the English dissenters and the Catholic bishops couldn't stomach the idea of someone who'd been having an affair, or rather than an affair, his long term partner was married. She wasn't living. I think she was more living with Parnell than the partner, so it wasn't an affair as such. Everybody knew, but it became public knowledge. He falls. The Irish Parliamentary Party splits. But while he was powerful, there's what called the Land War, and the Land League is founded to get better conditions for Irish peasant farmers and eventually get their own land. That was led by Michael Davitt. Michael Davitt was a former Fenian. He had spent quite a while in prison. The Fenians, in terms of success against the English, failed, but they were treated horribly in prison, etc. So they made a name for themselves by being in prison, and then when they got out of prison, some of them, like Davitt, got involved in politics and did a lot. So the Fenians remained behind the scenes. Um, Another important Fenian was called O'Donovan Rossa, and if you know the history of 1916, the 1916 Rising, O'Donovan Rossa was important because Porrick Pierce makes a speech at his grave. He died a little before 1916. And I remember this quote. I was told to memorize this quote when I was in sixth class. I think I was like 10. The fools, the fools, the fools, they've left us our Fenian dead. While we hold these graves, Ireland unfree shall never be at peace. It's a phrase that um, sums up a certain tradition of Irish nationalism. Um, then it's a West Cork man. Oh yeah, O'Donovan Rossa. Um, so the Fenians start to fade out, but I know that like you'll see Joyce referring to Fenians, etc. But around the turn of the century or slightly later, it starts to revive. The Irish Republican Brotherhood is a bit more secret, and it takes great advantage of the problems to do with home rule from 1912 on. So Parnell falls from power, the Irish Parliamentary Party splits because of him, and then after about 10 years it reunites, it becomes stronger, and in 1910 on, the Liberal government says, okay, we'll give you we'll present a home rule bill. Um, the last home rule bill had been rejected by the House of Lords. Although the House of Lords was unelected, it could effectively veto, could stop any bill, any law being passed if it voted against it. And since it was overwhelmingly full of reactionary lords and stuff like that who had no sympathy towards the Irish, it would always reject home rule. But in the first decade of the 20th century, the Liberal Party brought in a whole pile of reforms, the beginnings of the welfare state in a way, and the House of Lords kept rejecting this. So the Liberals managed to pass a reform which meant that the House of Lords could no longer reject. If it voted no, if the House voted yes again, then whatever the bill was would become law in 2 years' time. So in 1912, the Home Rule Bill is passed. The House of Lords votes against it. The House of Commons votes for it. So therefore, it's going to become law in 2 years. So in 1914, Ireland is going to get home rule. So the home rule struggle had started around 1820, so it's almost a 100-year struggle, and things should all be rosy, except, first of all, the Protestants in the north, or most of them, don't like the idea of home rule. You have, they say home rule is Rome rule, and the conservatives are stirring them up, and they form a paramilitary force, the Ulster Volunteer Force, and they bring in guns from Germany. So then the nationalists, the Catholic nationalists in Ireland say, okay, we can do the same thing. And they created the Irish Volunteers, and they brought some guns in and got shot at by the army, and several people got killed. I know that my grandfather was Secretary of the Volunteers in Glenbeigh, and he was also involved in Kiel. So this is 1912, 1914. And at that stage, you have the Curragh Mutiny. Basically, the English army are faced with, good point, Davy. Yeah, a guy called Holland invented the submarine. He was a Fenian. I'm not sure what happened with it, but he's credited being the first Fenian. So in 1913, he's a Fenian who's credited with designing the first submarine. In 1913, the British Army is told, look, next year home rule is coming in, and there's probably going to be armed reaction to it in Ulster. Will you do your duty and obey orders and enforce it when you're told to? And many of the senior officers in the Curragh basically said no. They were sounded out unofficially. So this is the Curragh Mutiny. Nothing happens. It's probably the only occasion when the British Army has ever gone as political as that and refused orders, and nothing happened. And then it's looking like there's going to be an armed conflict in Ireland. But a guy kills 2 people in Sarajevo in August 1914, and the world goes crazy. So World War I breaks out. The Home Rule Bill gets delayed, gets postponed, sorry. The Ulster Volunteers join the British Army, where they're given their own division. Most of the Irish volunteers joined the British Army where they're not given their own division at first. Some of them refuse to join, so you're left with, like, there's a split. There's a small group who say, no, we're not going to fight. Um, and this is where the IRB reappears. So they, whereas the first volunteer force was dominated by the Nationalist Party, now they're dominated by the IRB. The IRB Supreme Council, you have people like Porrick Pierce, MacDonough, um, all the guys who get shot in 1916. I think De Valera's on it as well. Um, so they say during this war, we're going to take the opportunity and have a rebellion, and they do. Long story short, I'll have to come back to that another day. It's a failure. It's unpopular at the time, except the British decide to execute the leader. So they shoot 15, and that does not go down well in Ireland. I think some of the nationalist MPs in London, the Irish ones in London, get up and say, "Look, you're making a complete and utter mess of this." So public opinion changes massively in Ireland. The IRB begins to reorganize, and basically it's now dominated by another Cork man, Dennis, who you know who it is, Michael Collins. And 1918 is election. Sinn Féin win the election in Ireland. They don't go to Westminster. They set up their own parliament at Dáil. There is a war of independence. 1921, at the end, there's a truce. Then 1922, there's independence and a civil war. And in the Civil War, Collins is killed, and after that, the IRB comes to an end. I know there's a far right group recently who are claiming to be IRB, and I think they're mixed up with the Sovereign Citizens, but they're nothing to do with the IRB. So that's the Fenians. And I forgot one thing about them. Believe it or not, they invaded Canada. In 1867, there was a group of Fenians, a large group in the States, in New York, and they decide that we're going to attack the British Empire, and the easiest way to do that is to invade Canada. So the American government kind of knew about this, but just said, these guys are crazy, they won't do anything. And off they go. They invade Canada. They run into I'm not sure if it's British Army or militia, whatever, but there's a battle. I think the Battle of Ridgeway, and the Fenians win. They rout this group that's sent to fight them. So they say great, and they march on into Canada, and they're waiting to get. There's loads more of Fenian men coming up to join them, except the American government panics because it was not expecting the Fenians to win. So it's severely embarrassed, and it effectively cuts off the border. So there's a large number of men and more supplies being sent up, but they don't manage to cross the border. So the Fenians are defeated in the next battle and forced back across the border. Yeah, Davey. So the US government stopped their supply trains. I'm not sure if it was under threat from Britain or it was just embarrassment because they kind of said, ha ha ha, oh, these mad Irish, they're going to invade Canada, let them, they'll make fools of themselves. Then they go, oops, they've won. They won a battle. We better do something or there'll be a major incident. So it was a bit of a mad thing to invade Canada from New York State. I'm not sure if anyone's written a novel about it or even a film. I remember years and years ago watching, I think it was called Centennial. It was one of these westerns that covers like hundreds of years. But there was a character in that. He was French Canadian, and he actually was involved in the militia that fought the Fenians. But I think he must have admired them because a few years later he led his own rebellion in Canada. Um, I think it didn't do much, but he was executed afterwards. I can't remember his name. I'm sure if this was a French Canadian discussion and I couldn't remember his name, I'd probably get killed. Yeah, I presume he was important enough. Um, so that's basically the Fenians. I hope I covered a very long period, very briefly. Eventually, I'll come back to things like 1916, etc. There's so many details about them that I'm trying to think how much to talk about, how much not to talk about. Um, Let me see. There were some comments. You're welcome, Kat. You're welcome. Um, and like the Fenians seem to be have been a very working class group. Um, a lot of them were very ordinary people, sort of, painters, carpenters, that sort of stuff. I'm not sure if any of my family were Fenians, but like my grandfather's cousin, first cousin, he was in the Irish Citizen Army and fought in 1916. But the records I have from that part of the family are not good because these were quite poor people. My grandfather was born in a two-room tenement in Montague Street, which is near Stephen's Green in Dublin. His father died in 1904 or something, and then in the 1911 census, they're the same address but in a one-room tenement. So they were poor, and the records are not good. Now, just looking. Oh yeah, Wayne, you mentioned Castle Hill, Vinegar Hill 2. Yeah, that's a very interesting rebellion. Years and years ago, when I was a kid, RT showed this Australian series. I think it was called Against the Wind. It was about uh, an Irish guy who, or is it a woman? I think it was an Irish woman who's um, sent out to a penal colony in Australia, and then they settle here, and then it gets caught up with that uprising. It's quite interesting. I think it was called Vinegar Hill too because a lot of the people involved in it had been sent out to Australia because they were involved in 1798, etc. Davy, the St. Patrick's Battalion, yeah, they would have been pre Fenians because the St. Patrick's Battalion was in the Mexican American War. I can't remember the exact dates, but I think it was in the 1850s or late 1840s. I think it was 1840s because um, but basically they they were Irish immigrants. Yeah, it was after the famine, but before the American Civil War. Irish immigrants were arriving, many of them poor, and many of the misfortunates who landed in New York or Boston at this time, they ended up in the American Army. And at this time, Catholics in the United States were uh, treated with great suspicion. You had a group called the Know Nothings, um, who were very very anti-Catholic. Um, the film Gangs of War, no, sorry, Gangs of New York, it shows some of the anti-Catholic hatred that you can find. So you had a bunch of these guys. They end up in the American Army, and then they find themselves fighting Catholics in Mexico, and then they kind of say, "Hey, we're on the wrong side." So a bunch of them change sides, and they form the St. Patrick's Battalion. Except for their bad luck, the Mexican army and especially the Mexican president Santa Anna were fairly crappy at that stage. So the Mexicans get badly defeated, and then there's a final battle. I think it's when they capture Mexico City, but a bunch of these members of the St. Tactics Battalion are were put on the scaffold at the beginning of the battle and only executed at the end. So some others were branded and like booted off. I know that there is a yearly commemoration in Mexico of them, but and I remember years ago watching an interesting film about it. I have no idea how. I can't remember. I had no idea at the time how good or bad historically it was. It was with Tom Berenger. I can't remember the name. It was an interesting film because you don't see that sort of stuff much. It reminded him of home. Didn't want to be part of an invading army, and I think the fact is many of the American officers would have been very anti-Catholic, and that many of these soldiers, and I imagine a certain amount of these soldiers had no English. They would have been Irish speaking. They kind of said, "Hold on, we're on the wrong side," or maybe they got tempted over by, I don't know, maybe some of them met women and stuff like that, or their friends dragged them over. It's interesting. It's an interesting thing. Wayne, you have Against the Wind on DVD, good series. Yeah, I remember watching it back in the days. We had four channels. We had RT1, RT2, BBC One. We had five: BBC One, BBC Two, and UTV. On these TVs with reception was funny. The video, like nowadays, if you looked at a 1970s TV, you'd say, "How could you see anything in that?" The quality was nothing like it is these days. Now, let me see. Can I pick just a short question to finish up? Um, dum 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 dum. Um, yeah. Since I started discussing 1798, could 1798 have won? I think so. Yes. Oh, thanks, Wayne. Just put the whole 10 hours for you on Facebook. I've seen it before. I'm sure. Oh, that's great. That's great. I don't know how you do that, but um, how? Oh, William Brown from the founder of the Argentinian Navy, but he wouldn't have been a Fenian. He was much earlier. He was much earlier. And you also have O'Higgins, who was like the founder of Chile. Um, so sorry. Could 1798 have won? Yes, if it had taken place 2 years earlier. Um, the United Irishmen had a strong structure. Then this fleet arrives. If that fleet had landed, history would have been different. Because I think there was more soldiers on the fleet than there were English. And at that stage, the United Irishmen, they still had a strong leadership, etc. Um, what happened in 1798 is that the leadership had been broken, and then you have local uprisings that are not really joined up. There's no overall strategic command. Like Cork in Cork, there was something tiny. Kerry, I don't think there was anything, or if it was tiny. Um, the the main uprisings would have been Wexford, Wicklow, um, Kildare, Mead, and then a couple of places in Ulster. And only when the second French fleet arrived do you have Mayo, and then they march into Longford where there's a battle. So most of Ireland doesn't get involved, but there was a huge sympathy for the United Irishmen, and like you can see that in Wexford where the amount of people who got involved was far greater than 1798. Um, people were disenfranchised. They were treated badly, and then there's this social explosion. There were complicated things, but like the British Army in their repression was fairly horrendous. So its repression created a fight back, which was huge. Yes, Cat, 1796 was kind of pivotal because it was a missed chance, and then the British government goes, "Oops, we better do something," and they begin to repress United Irishmen. Um, so perhaps if the United Irishmen um, had risen up in 1796, uh, history would have been different. The wild geese were meant to go over to Scotland at some point. Not exactly, but you're pointing at something. The basically the wild geese, they were allowed to depart Ireland after 1691, after the signing of the Treaty of Limerick, and they went to the French army. They fully expected to come back as part of a French invasion fleet within a number of years, because you had a war going on, you had a series of wars going on. Um, but jumping ahead 50 years, you have the final Jacobite rising, the 45. There were some Irish troops involved in that. I think the cavalry were all Irish in the French service. Um, and at the same time, you had the Battle of Fontenoy. I think that's in Belgium now, but it was a big battle between the French and the English, and the French won, and it was one of their few big victories over the English at that time. And the Irish Brigade kind of played the key role in the end of smashing the English. Um, Bonnie Prince Charlie and many others expected either the Spanish or the French to invade England or Scotland. Um, Again, you can argue the French messed up here because there's loads of politics involved, etc. So if the French had been a bit more brave, if they'd sent even a couple of thousand men to Scotland as a distraction, or even to Ireland as a distraction to the big fights that were going on in Europe, things could have been very, very different. Um, Sort of, but like and then the wild geese, you also had many serving in the Scottish army. So not the Scottish, the Spanish army. They had been serving there since 1600, basically. Okay, so it's just gone 8 o'clock. Oh, Kat, you mentioned Finn Dwyer's podcast. His stuff is very good. His stuff is very good. Has he done? I didn't know he'd done something in 1798. I must have a look. I haven't looked in a while. I've just been too busy. Um, okay, so I'll finish up then, and hopefully I'll see you next week. I couldn't make the podcast with the two guys last night because I had to pick up my wife in Killarney, and I thought I might be able to get on for the last hour, but her bus got delayed, and then the weather was terrible, so I have to cross over the mountains. It's not an easy drive, and when it's wet, raining, dark, foggy, it's complicated. So it was like 10 to 12 when I got home, and I just went straight to bed because I was up at 7. So, but I'll be back with them next week. Um, I'm not sure whether I'll do this on Tuesday or Thursday. Tuesday's a better day for me, but I'll see. And then I hope to have a new video out on Sunday on Inishfallen, the amazing place Inishfallen. So keep an eye out for that. So one night, Cat. Buenas noches in Spanish, or Portañol. So I will say good night, Sloan, and hope to see you soon. And um, if you have any questions, feel free to ask me. Okay, see you then. Bye bye. Thanks for watching, everyone. Bye bye.